Lightning cracked over the hills, and a woman ran through the freezing rain with a baby pressed against her chest, her bare feet bleeding on the gravel road, her breath tearing out of her in white clouds, as the iron gates of Ashcombe Manor rose out of the darkness like the last hope left in the world. Eleanor Hale did not stop running until her hand hit the cold metal of the gate. She pulled at it with what strength remained in her arms, but it did not move. She looked up at the great stone house beyond, its windows dark except for one flickering light on the second floor, and she began to shout, though her voice was raw and thin from hours of crying into the wind. "Please," she called, "please someone, my daughter is sick." No one answered. The rain fell harder, and somewhere behind her a dog barked in the distance, and Eleanor's knees buckled. She caught herself on the gate, wrapping one arm through the iron bars to keep from falling, holding her daughter tighter with the other. The baby, not yet a year old, had stopped crying an hour ago, and that silence frightened Eleanor more than any scream ever could. She pressed her lips to the child's forehead and felt heat there that should not have been, a fever climbing higher with every mile they had walked. She had left the last town 3 days ago, when the innkeeper told her she could not stay another night without payment, and she had no payment left. She had sold her wedding ring in the town before that. She had sold her mother's brooch in the town before that. There was nothing left to sell now except the small gold locket that hung around her daughter's neck, and that she would never part with, not even to save her own life, because it was the only thing her husband had left behind that still felt like him. Her husband. She did not let herself think his name too often anymore, because thinking it only brought back the 6 months since his fever took him, the 6 months of walking from place to place with a baby who grew thinner and a purse that grew lighter, the 6 months of doors closing in her face because a widow with no family name and no coin was not a woman most people wanted trouble with. She had knocked on the doors of relatives who did not answer letters. She had knocked on the doors of friends who suddenly did not remember her. And now she was knocking, quite literally, on the gates of a stranger's house, because it was the only house for miles, and because her daughter's small body could not survive another night in the cold. "Please," she called again, weaker now, "is anyone there?" A lantern moved somewhere near the house. Eleanor watched it bob through the darkness, coming closer, and for a moment hope rose in her chest so suddenly it hurt. Then the lantern reached the gate, and behind it stood a woman in a heavy shawl, her gray hair pinned back, her face lined with the particular sternness of someone who had spent a lifetime managing a great household and had little patience left for surprises. "Who goes there at this hour?" the woman demanded, though her voice was not unkind, only wary. "Please," Eleanor said, and this time the word broke apart in her mouth. "My baby, she has a fever. I have nowhere else to go." The woman lifted the lantern higher, and its light fell across Eleanor's face, her soaked hair plastered to her cheeks, the dark circles beneath her eyes, and then down to the small bundle in her arms, the tiny hand that had slipped free of the blanket and hung still against the cold. The woman's expression changed. Whatever suspicion had been there melted into something else, something older than manners, something that lived in mothers and grandmothers and women who had buried children of their own. "Merciful heavens," the woman whispered, and she was already fumbling with the latch. Come in quickly now." The gate swung open with a groan, and Eleanor stumbled through it, her legs nearly giving out entirely now that rescue was in reach. The woman caught her arm and half carried, half guided her up the long gravel path toward the house, murmuring reassurances that Eleanor barely heard over the pounding of her own heart. Behind them, thunder rolled across the hills, and the rain came down harder still, as if the sky itself did not want to let them go so easily. "I am Mrs. Whitmore," the woman said as they climbed the stone steps to the great door. "I keep this house. Now tell me quickly, girl, how long has the child had this fever?" "Since this morning," Eleanor managed. "It came on so fast. I thought it was only the cold, but then she stopped crying, and she has not cried since, and I do not know what that means, I only know it frightens me." Mrs. Whitmore's mouth tightened, but she said nothing more until they were inside, until the great door had shut behind them and the storm was, for the moment, only a sound against the walls rather than a force tearing at their skin. The hall was vast and dim, lit by a single candle left burning on a table, and the warmth of the house, however faint, felt to Alina like stepping into an entirely different world. "Sit here," Mrs. Whitmore said, guiding her to a bench near the hearth in the servants' corridor, where a low fire still glowed in the grate. "I will fetch dry blankets and send for the physician who lives in the village. Do not move from this spot." "Thank you," Alina whispered, and the tears she had been holding back for hours finally came, silent and exhausted, sliding down her face as she looked at her daughter's small, flushed cheeks. "Thank you. I did not know where else to bring her." Mrs. Whitmore paused at the door, studying the young woman before her, the fine bones of her face beneath the grime and exhaustion, the careful, cultured way she had spoken despite her ragged clothes. This was not a beggar by birth, whatever she had become through hardship. But those questions could wait. The child came first. "You did right to come here," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Whatever else is true, you did right to come here." She hurried away, her footsteps echoing down the long corridor, and Alina was left alone with the fire and her daughter and the terrible waiting silence that follows every plea for help. The silence in which a person can do nothing but hope that the help arrives in time. She unwrapped the wet blanket from around the baby and held her closer to the fire, rubbing warmth into the tiny limbs, whispering the same words she had whispered every night for 6 months. "Stay with me, Clara. Stay with me a little longer. We are almost somewhere safe now." She touched the small gold locket that hung on its chain around Clara's neck, the one piece of her husband that remained, and she closed her eyes and prayed to whatever was listening that this house, unlike so many others, would not turn them away in the morning. Mrs. Whitmore returned faster than Alina expected, with dry blankets over one arm and a young kitchen girl trailing behind her carrying a basin of warm water and clean cloths. Together they worked over the baby, sponging the small hot forehead, wrapping her in dry wool, and within a quarter of an hour Clara stirred and let out a thin, weak cry, which struck Alina as the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "There now," Mrs. Whitmore said, allowing herself the smallest smile. "She has some fight left in her yet. That is a very good sign. The physician will come within the hour. The stable boy has already gone for him. In the meantime, you will both stay warm by this fire, and you will drink something hot, and you will not argue with me about it." Alina laughed despite herself, a broken, grateful sound. "I would not dream of arguing with you." "Good, most people do not, once they know me a little better." Mrs. Whitmore busied herself pouring tea from a pot the kitchen girl had brought, pressing a cup into Alina's shaking hands. "Now, you need not tell me your whole history tonight if you are not ready, but I must ask you one thing because it matters greatly in this house. Do you have people who will come looking for you? A husband, perhaps, who does not know where you have gone?" Something in Alina's face must have answered before her words did, because Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened further. "My husband died 6 months ago," Alina said quietly, "of a fever much like the one that frightened me tonight. Since then it has been only Clara and myself, and I have gone from town to town looking for work or family or anyone who might help us, and I have found neither work nor family, only closed doors. I did not know this house was here until I saw its lights from the road. I am sorry to bring trouble to your master's doorstep. I did not know where else to turn." Mrs. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, and in that quiet Alina feared the sympathy might curdle into something more practical and less generous, the sympathy of a woman remembering that this was not her house to give away. But instead Mrs. Whitmore reached out and squeezed Alina's cold hand between her own. "You have brought no trouble that a good fire and a warm bed cannot answer," she said. "As for my master, he is away at present, seeing to business in the north, and will not return for some days yet. By the time he does, you will be recovered enough to explain yourselves properly, and I dare say by then his heart will have softened toward the matter, whatever he says about it beforehand. He is not so hard a man as he pretends to be, though he has had cause enough these last years to grow careful with strangers. I do not wish to impose upon his kindness before he has even agreed to it," Alina said. "Then we shall simply not tell him you are imposing," Mrs. Whitmore said, with the faint hint of mischief of a woman who had run a great house long enough to know exactly how much authority she truly held within its walls. You will call it a temporary shelter from the storm, which is nothing but the truth, and we shall see how the days unfold from there. The physician arrived within the hour, exactly as promised, a brisk gray-haired man who examined Clara with gentle, practiced hands and declared that the fever, while serious, had likely been brought on by cold and exhaustion rather than any deeper illness, and that with warmth, rest, and careful feeding, the child should recover within a matter of days. He left a small bottle of medicine and instructions for its use, and Mrs. Whitmore saw him out into the storm with brisk thanks and a coin pressed into his palm. When she returned, she found Alina asleep in the chair by the fire, Clara curled against her chest, both of them finally still after so many hours of struggle. Mrs. Whitmore did not wake them. She simply drew another blanket over the pair, banked the fire so it would burn steady through the night, and stood for a long moment looking down at the sleeping mother and child, wondering, as she often did about the strangers who occasionally found their way to this house, what story lay beneath the surface of this one, and whether it would prove to be a simple tale of hardship or something far stranger than that. She had no way of knowing, not yet, that the small gold locket resting against the sleeping baby's throat would soon turn this ordinary night of charity into the beginning of the strangest and most important discovery this house had seen in a generation. She only knew, as she banked the fire and turned down the last candle, that something about this widow and her child had unsettled her in a way she could not quite name, a feeling that clung to her as she walked the dark corridors back to her own room, a feeling that told her the storm outside was not the only thing that had changed in this house tonight. Outside, the rain continued through the small hours, drumming against the ancient stones of Ashcombe Manor, while inside, in the glow of a dying fire, a widow and her daughter slept more peacefully than they had in 6 long months, unaware that fate, patient and quiet, had already begun to turn its wheel toward them, and that in a matter of days everything Alina believed about her husband's past, and about the small locket she had guarded so fiercely, was about to change forever. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the thunder rolling away over the far hills until only a steady, gentler rain remained, tapping softly against the windows like something almost kind. Mrs. Whitmore rose before the rest of the house, as she always did, and made her way down to check on her unexpected guests, half expecting to find the young woman gone already, slipped away in the night out of some misplaced pride or fear. Instead, she found Alina exactly where she had left her, awake now, cradling Clara, who had taken a little broth and seemed, if not entirely recovered, at least no longer in danger. "You should have woken me for help," Mrs. Whitmore scolded gently, though there was no real heat in it. "You had already done so much," Alina said. "I did not want to trouble you further in the middle of the night." "Trouble is my business, my dear. It is what keeps this house running smoothly. Now come, both of you need proper rest in a proper bed, not a servant's bench by a dying fire." Mrs. Whitmore helped her rise, steadying her when her legs proved unsteady from days of walking and a night of little sleep, and led her up a narrow back staircase to a small but comfortable room, tucked away in a quiet wing rarely used by the family. "This will do for now. No one will disturb you here." "I cannot thank you enough," Alina said, lowering herself gratefully onto the soft bed, Clara already drifting back to sleep in her arms. "You may thank me by resting and letting that child heal," Mrs. Whitmore said. "There will be time enough for the rest of it later." She left Alina to sleep, and made her way back downstairs to begin the ordinary business of the day, though her mind kept returning, again and again, to the small gold locket she had glimpsed around the baby's neck the night before, catching the firelight in a way that had seemed, for just a moment, strangely familiar, though she could not for the life of her say why. The next several days passed in a quiet rhythm unlike anything Alina had known since her husband's death. She woke each morning to find a tray of food waiting outside her door, brought by the young kitchen girl, whose name turned out to be Poppy, and who seemed endlessly curious about the mysterious widow tucked away in the West Wing. Clara's fever broke fully by the 3rd day, and her small cheeks began to fill out again with color, her cries growing stronger and more insistent, which Alina had never in her life been so happy to hear. Mrs. Whitmore visited often, bringing news of the estate, small kindnesses disguised as practical necessities, a warmer blanket here, a better pair of shoes there, salvaged from some forgotten trunk in the attics. She asked no more questions about Alina's past than she had that first night, seeming content to let the young woman recover in peace, though Alina sensed, in the older woman's occasional lingering glances, that her curiosity had not vanished, only been set gently aside out of kindness. It was on the fourth evening, as Alina sat by the window rocking Clara to sleep, that she heard the sound of horses in the courtyard below, the clatter of hooves on stone, voices raised in greeting, and the unmistakable bustle of a household preparing to receive its master home. She rose and looked down through the rain-speckled glass to see a tall figure dismounting in the torchlight, cloaked against the weather, moving with the brisk, purposeful stride of a man used to being obeyed. Even from this distance, even through the darkness and the rain, there was something commanding about him, something that made the servants below straighten and hurry, that made even the horses seem to settle beneath his hand. Alina's stomach tightened. She had known this moment would come eventually, had known that Mrs. Whitmore's kindness could not shield her forever from the master of the house, whoever he was and whatever judgment he might pass on a penniless stranger sheltering beneath his roof. She held Clara a little closer, and watched the tall figure disappear through the great front doors, swallowed by the warm light spilling from within, and she found herself praying, for the second time in a week, that this house would not turn them away. She did not yet know his name. She did not yet know that he had buried a wife of his own not so many years past, that grief had made him careful in ways that sometimes looked like coldness to those who did not know him well, or that behind his stern reputation lived a man still capable of surprising even himself. She knew only that the Duke of Ashcombe had come home, and that tomorrow, one way or another, her fate and Clara's would be decided by a man she had never met. She slept poorly that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a full household settling in below her, footsteps and low voices, and the occasional creak of the old house adjusting to its master's return. When morning came, gray and quiet after so many days of storm, she dressed carefully in the mended clothes Mrs. Whitmore had provided, tied back her hair as neatly as she could manage, and sat by the window with Clara in her lap, waiting for whatever the day would bring, unaware that far below in his study, the Duke had already been told of the strangers sheltering in his west wing, and was, at that very moment, deciding what to do about them. Nathaniel Ashcombe stood at the window of his study with a letter still in his hand, though he had stopped reading it several minutes ago. His steward, a thin, anxious man named Mr. Prout, hovered near the door, waiting for a response that did not come quickly enough for his liking. "Your Grace," Prout said again, careful to keep his tone respectful, "I only mention it because the matter should have been brought to you the moment it happened. A woman arriving unannounced in the middle of a storm, taken in without your leave. It sets a poor precedent, if I may say so." "You may say so," Nathaniel said, still looking out at the gray morning. "You have said so 3 times already this morning." "Because it troubles me, Your Grace. We know nothing of this woman. She could be anyone. She could be running from debt or from worse. And now she has been given a room in the West Wing as though she were a guest of standing." Nathaniel turned from the window at last, folding the letter and setting it on his desk with more force than was strictly necessary. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had begun just slightly to gray at the temples, though he was not yet 40. His face carried the particular weariness of a man who had spent years carrying responsibilities that were never meant to be carried alone, and his eyes, though sharp and assessing, held a guardedness that had settled there some time after his wife's death, 4 years past, and had never quite left. "Mrs. Whitmore has run this house for 20 years, he said. "If she judged it right to take in a woman and a sick child during a storm, I am not inclined to second-guess her on the matter of a single night's shelter." "It has been 4 nights, Your Grace, not 1. That gave Nathaniel pause. He had not realized so much time had passed since his return, had not thought to ask precisely how long the strangers had been under his roof. 4 nights was rather more than a single night's charity, 4 nights began to look like something closer to residence. "Send for Mrs. Whitmore," he said finally. "I will hear the whole of it from her before I decide anything." Mrs. Whitmore arrived within minutes, composed as always, though Nathaniel had known her long enough to read the small signs of concern in the set of her shoulders, the way she folded her hands together before she spoke, as though bracing herself for an argument she had already rehearsed in her mind. "Your Grace," she said with a small curtsy, "I am glad to see you returned safely." "Tell me about the widow," Nathaniel said, without preamble, because he had learned long ago that Mrs. Whitmore respected directness far more than pleasantries. "Prout informs me she has been here 4 days. "She has, Your Grace, and I will tell you plainly, I would do the very same thing again tonight if the circumstance repeated itself. She arrived in the worst of the storm, half frozen, carrying a baby with a fever so high I feared the child would not survive the night. She had walked for hours in the rain, from the nearest town, with nowhere else to turn. I would not have turned away a stray dog in that condition, Your Grace, let alone a mother and her child. And now the child is recovered." "Nearly so. Another day or 2 of rest and good food, and she will be entirely well." "And the mother, what do you know of her?" Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, which was unlike her, and Nathaniel noticed it at once. "Little enough, Your Grace, though I have not pressed her hard for it, given the state she arrived in. She tells me her husband died some 6 months past of a fever, and that she has been traveling since, looking for work or for family who might take her in, and finding neither. She speaks well, Your Grace, better than her clothes would suggest. I do not believe she is a common beggar, whatever hardship has brought her to this state." Nathaniel considered this in silence for a long moment, turning it over the way he turned over most difficult decisions, weighing caution against the plainer, simpler instinct that had guided Mrs. Whitmore 4 nights ago in the storm. "I will see her," he said at last, "this afternoon. I will hear her circumstances from her own mouth, and then I will decide what is to be done." "Thank you, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitmore said, and though her relief was carefully hidden, Nathaniel caught the edge of it in her voice as she left the room. The summons came to Alina a little after midday, delivered by Poppy, who arrived slightly out of breath and clearly nervous on Alina's behalf. "His Grace wishes to see you in the study, ma'am, as soon as you are able. Mrs. Whitmore says not to be afraid, he is fair, even if he seems stern at first." Alina's stomach dropped all the same. She dressed Clara warmly and carried her along, unwilling to be parted from her daughter even for the length of this interview, and followed Poppy down through unfamiliar corridors until they reached a heavy oak door, behind which she could hear the low murmur of a man's voice giving some final instruction to a servant. The door opened, and Alina stepped into a room lined floor to ceiling with books, a great desk positioned near tall windows that let in what pale light the gray day offered. And behind that desk stood the man she had glimpsed from her window the night before, taller now that she stood before him, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes moving over her with the careful, assessing look of a man used to judging character quickly and rarely being wrong. "Your Grace," Alina said, dropping into as steady a curtsy as she could manage with a baby balanced on her hip. "I am Alina Hale. I must thank you before anything else for the shelter your household has given us. Without it, I do not know that my daughter would have survived the night." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment before answering, and Alina forced herself to meet his gaze rather than look away, sensing somehow that this man would respect steadiness far more than a show of meekness. "Sit, Mrs. Hale," he said finally, gesturing to a chair near the desk. "I am told your husband died some months ago, and that you have been traveling since in search of work or family. I would like to hear the whole of it if you are willing to tell it." And so Alina told him. She told him of her marriage, 3 years past, to a quiet, gentle man who had never spoken much of his own family, who had claimed to be estranged from them over some old disagreement he preferred not to discuss, who had made his modest living as a tutor and later as a clerk in a merchant's office, and who had died suddenly of a fever that had swept through their small town 6 months before. She told him of the debts left behind, small but enough to strip her of what little they owned, of the doors that had closed on her since, of relations who did not answer letters and old friends who suddenly had no room to spare. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, and Nathaniel found himself listening more closely than he had expected to, watching her face for the small signs of falsehood he had learned to look for over the years, and finding none. "You say your husband never spoke of his family," Nathaniel said when she had finished. "Did he never give a reason?" "Only that there had been a falling out long before I knew him, and that it had cost him dearly enough that he did not care to speak of it again. I did not press him. I saw no need to reopen old wounds when we were happy enough as we were." She paused, and something flickered across her face, quick and private. "He did keep one thing from that part of his life, a locket which he gave to our daughter shortly before he died. He said it belonged to their family, and that she should have it, whatever else was lost." Nathaniel's attention sharpened at this, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "May I see it?" Elinor hesitated only a moment before reaching to the small clasp at Clara's neck and carefully unfastening the delicate chain, passing the locket across the desk. Nathaniel took it in his hand, and though he did not open it in that moment, something about its weight, its craftsmanship, the small worn engraving on its outer face, sent an uneasy prickle down the back of his neck, a feeling he could not yet name but which he would not forget. "It is finely made," he said, turning it over once before passing it back to her. "An unusual thing for a clerk's daughter to own." "He said it was the last thing of value his family had left him," Elinor said, refastening it carefully around Clara's neck. "I have never sold it, whatever else we lost. It seemed wrong, somehow, to part with the one thing he wanted her to keep." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming once against the surface of his desk before he seemed to gather himself and return to more practical matters. "You have nowhere else to go, Mrs. Hale. No family who will take you in, no position waiting for you elsewhere." "None, Your Grace. I will not pretend otherwise to win your sympathy. I have told you the truth of my circumstances, because I believe you would see through anything less." Something in her directness seemed to settle whatever remained of his doubt, or perhaps it was simply the child, who chose that moment to reach out one small hand toward him with the fearless curiosity only babies possess, making a soft, questioning sound that broke, just slightly, the formality of the room. Nathaniel looked at the child for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then he looked back at Elinor. "You may remain here 1 week," he said. "During that time, Mrs. Whitmore will see that you and your daughter are properly cared for, and you may make use of that time to consider what you wish to do next. I will not turn a sick child and her mother out into the roads without a plan in place for their welfare. But I want it understood clearly, Mrs. Hale, that this is a temporary arrangement made out of practical charity and nothing more." "I understand, Your Grace," Elinor said, rising and curtsying again, relief and something like wariness mingling in her chest in equal measure. "I am grateful for whatever time you can spare us." She left the study with Clara held close, and Nathaniel remained behind at his desk for a long while after the door had shut, staring at nothing in particular, his mind returning again and again to the small gold locket and the strange, unwelcome familiarity it had stirred in him, a feeling he could not place but which refused, stubbornly, to let him go. That night, long after the household had gone quiet, Nathaniel found himself unable to sleep. He rose from his bed and lit a candle, and made his way down to the small portrait gallery that ran along the eastern side of the house, where generations of Ashcombs looked down from their frames with expressions ranging from stern to serene. He walked slowly past them until he reached one particular portrait, tucked into a shadowed corner, of a younger man with dark hair and a familiar set to his jaw, painted many years before, when that young man had still been welcome in this house. His younger brother, Julian, gone 8 years now, vanished after a bitter quarrel that Nathaniel still, in his private hours, regretted more than he had ever admitted to anyone. He stood before the portrait a long while, candle flickering, studying the painted face for some echo of the locket he had held that afternoon, though he told himself the resemblance he sensed was nothing more than an old man's grief playing tricks on a tired mind. He told himself this several times, in fact, as he made his way back to his cold and silent bed, though sleep, when it finally came, brought with it dreams of his brother's face, and of a small gold locket that seemed, in the strange logic of dreams, to open of its own accord, spilling out secrets Nathaniel was not yet ready to face in the waking world. The days that followed settled into an uneasy but gentler rhythm. Eleanor kept mostly to the west wing, as she felt was proper, though Clara's recovering health meant the child grew restless indoors, and on the third morning of their reprieve, Eleanor carried her out to the small enclosed garden behind the kitchens, where autumn roses still clung stubbornly to their last blooms, and the air, though cool, was blessedly free of rain. She did not expect to encounter the Duke there. He came around the hedge with a book under one arm, clearly seeking quiet solitude of his own, and stopped short at the sight of her, an unreadable expression crossing his face before he recovered his composure. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I did not expect to find anyone here." "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. Clara has been cooped up indoors for days, and I thought the fresh air might do her good. We will go elsewhere if we are in your way." "You are not in my way." He said it more quickly than he intended, and seemed almost surprised at himself for saying it. He lingered a moment, watching as Clara reached with delighted fingers toward a low branch of rose hips just out of her grasp, making small sounds of frustrated ambition that pulled, despite himself, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. "She has a great deal of will for such a small creature." "She takes after her father in that regard," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself, and something in her voice softened at the memory, enough that Nathaniel noticed it. "You loved him very much," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did. He was quiet and careful, and he carried some old sadness in him that I never fully understood, but he was good to us, in every way that mattered." She looked down at Clara, adjusting the child's wrap against the cool air. "I think, sometimes, that whatever he ran from in his past, he spent the rest of his life trying to build something gentler in its place. I only wish he had lived long enough to see how well he succeeded." Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that Eleanor could not read. And then, quite abruptly, he excused himself and returned to the house, leaving Eleanor faintly puzzled by the sudden shift in his manner, though she thought little more of it, attributing it simply to the natural reserve of a man unused to idle conversation with strangers under his own roof. She did not know that Nathaniel had gone straight to his study, shut the door, and sat for a long while with his head in his hands, turning over in his mind everything he had heard, everything he had seen, weighing it all against the fading portrait of his brother in the gallery, and the strange, insistent pull the locket had exerted on him from the very first moment he held it. That evening, after the household had settled and Eleanor had put Clara down to sleep in the small crib Mrs. Whitmore had found for her, there came a soft knock at the door of Eleanor's room. She opened it to find the housekeeper herself, candle in hand, an unusually careful expression on her face. "His Grace wishes to speak with you again, Mrs. Hale, if you are able. He asks that you bring the locket." Something in the request unsettled Eleanor, though she could not have said precisely why, and she followed Mrs. Whitmore down through the quiet house with a growing sense that whatever conversation awaited her would not be a simple one. Nathaniel was waiting in his study, standing near the fire rather than seated behind his desk, and when Eleanor entered he gestured for her to sit, though he himself remained standing, restless in a way she had not seen in him before. "Thank you for coming at this hour," he said. "I would not have asked it of you were the matter not important. May I see the locket again?" Eleanor removed it carefully from around her own neck, where she had taken to wearing it while Clara slept, unwilling to let it out of her sight even for a few hours, and passed it across to him. Nathaniel took it with hands that were, Eleanor noticed, not quite steady, and this time, instead of merely turning it over as he had before, he pressed the small catch at its edge and opened it. Inside, on one side, was a tiny painted portrait of a woman Eleanor did not recognize, faded with age, her features delicate and kind. On the other side was an engraving, fine and precise, of a crest, a rearing hawk beneath a crown of oak leaves, worked into the gold with the careful hand of a skilled jeweler. Nathaniel stared at that crest for a long, silent moment, and when he finally looked up at Alina, his face had gone pale in a way that frightened her more than any anger could have. "Where did your husband say this locket came from?" he asked, and his voice had changed entirely, low and careful, as though he were holding something back with great effort. "He said it belonged to his family," Alina said slowly, alarm rising in her chest at his expression. "He never told me more than that. Your Grace, you are frightening me. What is it? What have you seen?" Nathaniel closed the locket slowly, and when he spoke again, his words fell into the quiet room like stones dropped into still water. "This crest," he said, "belongs to my family. It is the crest of the house of Ashcombe. This locket was made for my mother, and given, upon her death, to my younger brother Julian, who vanished from this house 8 years ago and was never heard from again." Alina felt the room tilt slightly around her, her hands going cold despite the warmth of the fire. "That is not possible," she whispered. "My husband's name was Julian Hale. He told me his family disowned him, that there had been some falling out he did not wish to discuss. He never once mentioned a title or a crest, or—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat as the full weight of what Nathaniel was suggesting settled over her. Impossible, and yet, in some strange way, suddenly, terribly plausible. "He never mentioned a brother," she finished quietly. "No," Nathaniel said, and for the first time since she had met him, his composure seemed to crack entirely, grief and disbelief, and something almost like hope moving across his face all at once. "He would not have. We parted on terms bitter enough that I do not imagine he cared to speak my name again as long as he lived." Alina sat very still, her mind racing back over 3 years of marriage, searching for some sign she might have missed, some clue her husband had let slip in a careless moment, and finding, now that she looked, small strange fragments that had never quite fit before. The way he had sometimes stared too long at fine houses they passed on the road, saying nothing. The careful, cultivated manner of speech that had always seemed slightly too refined for a merchant's clerk. The single time, early in their marriage, when he had wept without explanation on an evening she later realized had been the anniversary of his mother's death, though she had not known that at the time. "If what you say is true," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "then my daughter is your niece." Nathaniel did not answer at once. He simply looked at her and then past her, toward the door beyond which Clara slept, unaware that her small sleeping form had just become, in the space of a single evening, the last living heir to a legacy her father had spent 8 years trying to escape. "I do not know what is true yet," he said finally, though the words carried little conviction. "But I intend to find out, Mrs. Hale, whatever it costs either of us to learn it." He did not sleep at all that night. Long after Alina had returned to her room, shaken and sleepless herself, Nathaniel sat alone in his study with the locket open before him on the desk, staring at the small painted portrait of his mother and the crest beside it, turning over 8 years of silence, and searching his memory for anything that might confirm or deny what his instincts had already, stubbornly, begun to believe. He rose before dawn and made his way to the estate's old records room, a cramped chamber above the west stables where generations of correspondence, ledgers, and family papers had been stored, dusty and half forgotten, by stewards long since retired. He had not set foot in this room in years, had in truth avoided it deliberately, since it held too many reminders of the brother he had quarreled with and lost. Now he searched through it with a kind of desperate patience, opening trunk after trunk, sorting through letters yellowed with age, until his fingers closed on a small bundle tied with faded ribbon, letters in his brother's own hand, written in the months before he vanished. Nathaniel carried them back to his study and read them by candlelight as the sun rose slowly outside his window. Most were ordinary things, requests for funds, complaints about their late father's temper, occasional flashes of the dry humor Julian had always possessed even in his darkest moods. But one letter, the last in the bundle, dated only weeks before Julian's disappearance, stopped Nathaniel cold. "I cannot remain in a house that sees me only as a disappointment," Julian had written, his hand tighter and more urgent than in his other letters. Father has made his feelings plain enough, and you, brother, though you say nothing, look at me the same way. I will not stay to be measured forever against a standard I never asked to meet. When I am gone, do not trouble yourself searching for me. I intend to become someone entirely new, someone judged by his own hands and not by the name he was born to. Tell Mother's Locket, if it ever comes to mind, that I did not forget her, whatever else I chose to leave behind. Nathaniel read the letter 3 times before setting it down, his hands trembling slightly, old guilt rising in him with a force he had not expected after so many years. He had told himself, across all this time, that Julian's disappearance had been a young man's dramatic flourish, a temporary absence that would end in a letter, a reconciliation, a return. He had not understood, until reading these words again with fresh eyes, how deeply his own silence, his own failure to intervene between Julian and their exacting father, had contributed to his brother's decision to vanish entirely. He spent the following 2 days pursuing every thread he could find. He wrote to the old family solicitor, now retired but still sharp of memory, asking whether any record existed of Julian's movements after he left Ashcombe. He questioned the eldest of the household staff, servants who had known Julian as a boy, and found an aging groundskeeper named Mr. Aldous, who remembered driving Julian to the coaching inn in the nearest town on the very night he disappeared, and who recalled with some effort that Julian had spoken of traveling south, toward the smaller towns where a man with no title and an assumed name might disappear into ordinary life without difficulty. He compared these fragments against everything Alina had told him of her husband, the timing, the manner, the careful refusal to speak of his past, and piece by piece a picture assembled itself that Nathaniel could no longer dismiss as coincidence or wishful thinking. Julian Hale, quiet clerk and devoted husband, gentle father to a small girl he had loved fiercely enough to give her their mother's locket before he died, was, Nathaniel became certain, none other than his own brother, who had shed his title and his name 8 years before, and built, in the years that followed, precisely the ordinary, unremarkable life he had once declared he wanted. The solicitor's reply, when it finally arrived, confirmed the last piece Nathaniel needed. Records of a death registered under the name Julian Hale, in a town some 60 miles south, matched the date Alina had given him almost exactly, and a description provided by the local registrar, height, coloring, a small scar above the left eyebrow that Nathaniel remembered clearly from a childhood accident involving a fallen tree branch, left no reasonable doubt remaining. Nathaniel sat with this confirmation for a long while before he finally rose, gathered the letters and the solicitor's reply, and made his way toward the west wing, toward the room where Alina and Clara had made their temporary home, carrying with him not only the truth he had promised to find, but the far more difficult task of deciding how and whether to share it. Alina was seated by the window when he knocked, Clara playing contentedly on a blanket at her feet, and something in Nathaniel's face as he entered told her at once that whatever he had come to say would not be easily received. "You have found something," she said before he could speak. "I have." He set the letters and the solicitor's reply on the small table between them, though he did not immediately explain their contents. "Mrs. Hale, I must ask you to sit, and to hear me through entirely before you respond, because what I have to tell you will not be simple, and I do not wish you to draw conclusions before you have all of it." Alina sat, her hands folding tightly in her lap, and listened as Nathaniel laid out, piece by careful piece, everything he had discovered. The letter Julian had left behind, full of hurt and stubborn pride. The groundskeeper's memory of driving him to the coaching inn on the night he vanished. The solicitor's confirmation, matching name, date, and even the small scar above his left eyebrow, that left no reasonable doubt that Julian Hale, her husband, had been born Julian Ashcombe, the Duke's own younger brother. By the time he finished, Alina's face had gone quite pale, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring down at Clara, who had rolled onto her back and was reaching contentedly for her own toes, entirely unaware that the room around her had just tilted on its axis. "I do not know what to say," Alina finally managed. I do not know whether to be glad of this or afraid of it. If what you say is true, then everything he told me about himself, his family, his past, all of it was built on a name that was never truly his. The man you married was real, Nathaniel said, more gently than she had yet heard him speak. Whatever name he used, whatever he chose to leave behind, the affection he gave you, the care he gave your daughter, none of that was false. I believe, from everything you have told me of him, that he built a genuinely good life in the years he was away from us. That is not nothing, Mrs. Hale. In some ways it may be the truest thing about him. Eleanor's eyes filled unexpectedly, and she pressed a hand briefly to her mouth before she trusted herself to speak again. I fear how this will look to others, she said. A penniless widow, arriving at your gates in a storm, and then within the week discovered to be married, however unknowingly, to your own brother and mother to your niece. It will look like scheming, Your Grace, however innocent the truth of it. I have no way to prove I did not know, no way to prove I have not simply invented a convenient story to secure my daughter's future at your expense. You forget, Nathaniel said, that I am the one who discovered the locket, who pursued the letters, who confirmed the truth through my own solicitor and my own household's memory. You told me nothing you did not believe entirely, and you offered no claim upon this family before I brought the matter to you myself. If anyone here has reason to fear how this looks, Mrs. Hale, it is not you. And yet the world will not trouble itself with such careful distinctions, Eleanor said quietly. It will simply see a widow and a fortune, and draw whatever conclusions suit its taste for scandal. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, watching her, something shifting behind his eyes that had not been there before, a kind of resolve settling over his earlier caution. Then the world will have to content itself with being wrong, he said. I did not survive my own share of scandal and grief these past years by allowing gossip to dictate my decisions, and I do not intend to begin now, over a matter that concerns my own family's blood. He picked up the letters again, turning them over in his hands, and something in his expression softened into an old, private sorrow that had nothing to do with Eleanor at all. I quarreled with Julian before he left. Our father was a hard man, exacting in ways that wounded Julian more deeply than I understood at the time, and I did not stand between them as I should have. I told myself for years that Julian's leaving was his own choice, his own dramatic gesture, and that he would return when his temper cooled. I did not understand, until I read that letter again this morning, how much my own silence had contributed to his decision to vanish entirely rather than remain and be endlessly measured against a standard neither of us ever chose. You could not have known he would never return, Eleanor said softly. Perhaps not, but I could have written. I could have gone after him. I chose instead to let my pride stand where my affection for my brother should have stood, and 8 years passed, and now he is gone entirely, and the only piece of him left in this world is sleeping on that blanket, entirely unaware of the history she carries. He looked at Clara again, and something in his face, some careful barrier long maintained, seemed for just a moment to give way entirely. I do not intend to make the same mistake twice, Mrs. Hale. Whatever you decide, whatever comes of this discovery, I will not let my own pride cost this family another loss it might have prevented. Eleanor watched him for a long moment, seeing past the stern reserve she had first encountered to something rower and more honest beneath it. And she felt, for the first time since her husband's death, something other than fear or exhaustion settle into the space where hope might, cautiously, begin to grow again. Then perhaps, she said quietly, we might begin by simply telling each other the truth, whatever comes of it, rather than guarding ourselves against what the world might think. Nathaniel looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at his gates, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth. That, he said, seems a reasonable place to begin. The weeks that followed carried a quiet, careful change through Ashcombe Manor, the kind that moves slowly enough that no single day feels different from the last, until one morning a person looks back and realizes the whole shape of things has shifted. Eleanor no longer kept to the west wing out of necessity, though she still moved through the great house with a certain instinctive caution, unused to rooms so large or halls so long after years of small rented lodgings. Mrs. Whitmore, once she learned the truth of the matter, took to the news with the brisk practicality of a woman who had half suspected something unusual from that very first night, and set about the business of settling Alina and Clara properly, arranging finer clothes, a proper nursery, and a small staff of her own choosing to assist with the child's care. Nathaniel, for his part, found himself drawn to the nursery far more often than either dignity or habit would have predicted. He told himself at first that his visits were simply a matter of duty, an uncle's obligation to know his niece, but Mrs. Whitmore, watching him linger over Clara's crib on more evenings than strictly necessary, allowed herself small private smiles that she was careful never to share aloud. "She has your brother's eyes," he said to Alina one evening, as Clara gripped his finger with surprising strength and studied his face with the frank, unblinking curiosity particular to very young children. "I had forgotten how much they favored our mother's side of the family until I saw them again in her." "He spoke of his mother sometimes," Alina said, settling into the chair across from him, watching the careful, unguarded way he handled the child, so different from the reserved man who had first summoned her to his study. "Never by name and never at length, but there was a tenderness in how he spoke of her that I never fully understood until now." "She died when Julian and I were both still young," Nathaniel said. "He took it harder than I did, I think. He was the more sensitive of us always, though our father had little patience for sensitivity in a son who was meant to one day manage an estate and a title. I sometimes wonder whether things might have gone differently between us if she had lived longer to soften our father's edges." Alina said nothing to this, only watched him, and something in the quiet understanding between them, unspoken and undemanding, settled comfortably into the room alongside the evening fire. Word of the discovery, of course, could not remain contained within the household for long, however carefully Nathaniel and Mrs. Whitmore tried to manage it. Servants talk and visitors notice, and within a month the story had begun to circulate through the neighboring estates and the nearest town in the particular embellished form that gossip always assumes as it travels. A penniless widow, it was whispered, had arrived at the Duke's gates and been discovered, through some remarkable stroke of fortune, to be secretly connected to his own bloodline. Some versions of the tale painted Alina as a clever schemer who had known all along and orchestrated the entire arrival for her own advantage. Other versions, kinder but no less invasive, painted her as the tragic heroine of a story too remarkable to be entirely true. Alina bore this attention with more grace than she felt, though the whispered glances of visiting gentry, when Nathaniel occasionally received them, wore at her more than she admitted aloud. It was Nathaniel himself, in the end, who addressed the matter most directly, standing beside her at a small gathering of neighboring families invited to the manor one autumn evening, his hand resting lightly but deliberately at the small of her back in a manner that left no ambiguity about where his loyalty stood. "Mrs. Hale's account has been examined thoroughly and confirmed by my own solicitor and my own household's records," he said, when one particularly bold matron ventured a probing question disguised as polite curiosity. "I would ask that anyone who doubts the matter bring their concerns to me directly, rather than trading in speculation that does a grieving young mother no credit." The room fell into an obedient, chastened silence, and though Alina said nothing in that moment, she felt something in her chest loosen slightly, a burden she had not fully realized she was still carrying, lightened by the simple, unwavering fact of his defense. It was not long after this that the staff, and eventually the neighboring families, began to notice something else entirely, something neither Nathaniel nor Alina had quite acknowledged to themselves, let alone to each other. The way his eyes sought her out first upon entering any room. The way she had begun, almost without noticing, to save small observations through her day specifically to share with him over the evening fire. The careful, deliberate distance they both still maintained, out of propriety, out of the delicate newness of Alina's mourning, out of an unspoken caution neither wished to examine too closely, though it grew harder with each passing week to disguise as anything other than what it plainly was. "You are staring again, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitmore observed dryly one evening, finding him in the small drawing-room long after Alina had retired, still turning a book he had not read a single page of in his hands. "I am reading," Nathaniel said, without much conviction. "You are reading the same page you were reading an hour ago, and you have not turned it once in all that time." Mrs. Whitmore allowed herself a small, knowing smile as she set about banking the fire for the night. "I have run this house through your father's time and yours, Your Grace, and I have seen a great many things pass through these halls. I have not in all that time seen you look at anyone the way you look at that young woman, not since your late wife. God rest her. And I do not think it does either of you any good to pretend otherwise, whatever proprieties you feel obliged to observe." Nathaniel set the book down at last, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "It is complicated, Mrs. Whitmore. She is only lately widowed. She is the mother of my niece. There are questions of inheritance, of appearances, of what is owed to Clara's future that must be settled before I can allow myself to consider anything more." "There are always questions, Your Grace, if a person goes looking hard enough for reasons to delay." Mrs. Whitmore straightened from the hearth and regarded him with the particular fondness of a woman who had, in her own way, helped raise him since boyhood. "But I have found, in my long years, that the questions worth answering rarely wait patiently for us to feel entirely ready before they demand an answer. You might consider, when you are ready, simply asking her what she wants, rather than deciding on her behalf what proprieties require." She left him with that thought, and Nathaniel sat alone a good while longer, the fire burning low, turning her words over with the same careful deliberation he brought to every difficult decision, though this one, he was beginning to admit to himself, might prove far harder to resolve through reason alone. The matter of Clara's standing was settled first, as Nathaniel had always intended it should be, before anything else was allowed to move forward. He summoned his solicitor from the city, a careful, precise man well versed in matters of succession and legitimacy, and together they reviewed every document, every letter, every confirmed detail of Julian's life and death, until a formal record was drawn up recognizing Clara as the daughter of Julian Ashcombe, and therefore niece to the Duke and rightful heir to a settled portion of the family's holdings, sufficient to secure her future regardless of whatever else life might bring her. The announcement, when it was formally made before the assembled household and a small gathering of the neighboring gentry, was met with considerably less scandal than the earlier gossip had promised. For Nathaniel had taken care to present the matter plainly and without apology, and few among the local families cared to argue publicly with a duke who had already made his position, and his affections, entirely clear through weeks of steady, unwavering conduct. Alina stood beside him through the reading of the formal declaration, Clara asleep against her shoulder, and felt, for the first time since her husband's death, something like solid ground beneath her feet after so many months of uncertain, shifting sand. Whatever came next, her daughter's future was secured, not through charity or pity, but through the plain, undeniable fact of her birth and the courage of a man willing to stand publicly behind the truth of it. It was several evenings later, after the formalities had settled, and the household had returned to its quieter rhythms, that Nathaniel found Alina alone in the small garden behind the kitchens, where the last of the autumn roses had finally given way to the first frost, though a few stubborn blooms still clung on despite the cold. "I have been considering something," he said, coming to stand beside her, his hands clasped loosely behind his back in the careful posture of a man working up to a difficult subject. "Now that Clara's future is settled, I find myself uncertain what to do about my own." "Your own future seems settled enough, Your Grace," Alina said, though something in her voice suggested she understood there was more beneath his words than the plain statement offered. "You have an estate to manage, a niece to guide into her inheritance, and a household that runs, by all appearances, rather well without needing further complication from me." "That is precisely the difficulty," Nathaniel said. "I find I do not wish for things to run simply, if simplicity means you and Clara eventually leaving this house to build some separate life elsewhere. I have grown accustomed to her laughter down these halls, Mrs. Hale, and to yours as well, more than I expected to when you first arrived at my gates half frozen in that storm. I do not know how to say this without sounding as though I am speaking only of duty or convenience, because it is neither of those things, not any longer. Elinor turned to face him fully, her heart beating faster than the cold evening air alone could account for. Then say plainly what it is you mean, Your Grace, and let us not dance around it with careful words neither of us quite trusts. Nathaniel took a breath, and for a moment the stern, guarded reserve that had defined him for years fell away entirely, leaving only the plain honesty of a man who had, against every careful instinct he possessed, allowed himself to hope again. I am asking you to stay, Elinor. Not as a guest under temporary charity, and not merely as the mother of my niece, but as someone I have come, these past weeks, to care for a great deal more deeply than I expected any stranger arriving at my gates to ever make me feel again. I do not ask this lightly, nor do I ask it to settle some matter of appearances. I ask it because this house has felt, since your arrival, more like a home than it has in the 4 years since I buried my own wife, and I find I am not eager to let that feeling go. Elinor felt tears rise unbidden, though these were nothing like the exhausted, desperate tears she had shed at his gates so many weeks before. I came to this house with nothing, she said softly, expecting, at best, a single night's shelter from the storm. I did not imagine I would find at the end of it not only my daughter's future secured, but a home I had stopped believing I would ever have again. Is that an answer, Mrs. Hale? Nathaniel asked, the faintest, hopeful smile breaking through his careful composure at last. It is a beginning of one, Elinor said, and she let him take her hand there in the frost-touched garden, the last stubborn roses trembling faintly in the cold evening air around them. Ask me again properly, Your Grace, when the time is right, and you may have your full answer then. Nathaniel laughed, low and warm, a sound Mrs. Whitmore would later swear she had not heard from him in all the years since his wife's death, and he did not let go of her hand as they walked back together toward the lit windows of the great house, toward the small, sleeping girl whose gold locket had, quite unexpectedly, brought an entire family back from the edge of being lost forever. In the months that followed, Ashcombe Manor changed in ways the old stones themselves seemed to welcome. The halls filled again with laughter, the nursery no longer a quiet, unused room but the center of the household's warmest hours, and when spring finally arrived and Nathaniel did indeed ask Elinor properly for her hand, the answer she gave him carried none of the caution of that first frosted evening, only the plain, certain gladness of a woman who had walked through a great deal of darkness to finally find her way home. Clara grew in time into a bright and curious child who never remembered the storm that had brought her to Ashcombe, nor the desperate hours of her mother's journey, knowing only the steady, loving household that surrounded her from her earliest memories, unaware that the small gold locket she would one day wear as a young woman had once been the single thread connecting an entire family back together, out of grief, out of guilt long carried, and out of one bitter storm that had, against every expectation, delivered exactly the shelter a penniless widow and her daughter had needed most.